The hunt had her surrounded. Then every wolf in that circle turned its back to her and faced the dark instead. Elara's breath hitched a plume of white in the frozen air. She did not move. To move was to be prey. She had learned that lesson in bone-deep cold, long before this forest, long before the king's hunt had swept through these ancient woods like a storm of steel and fur. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone, but her body was stone. Her hand rested on the hilt of the skinning knife tucked into her belt. Its worn leather, a familiar comfort against her palm, it was a pathetic weapon against a royal hunting pack, against the beasts of shadow and sinew that now formed a living wall around her. But it was hers. The wolves were enormous, larger than any she had seen in the wild territories. Their coats were the color of slate and smoke, the shoulders corded with muscle. They did not growl. They did not snarl. They simply stood, a silent, disciplined perimeter, their collective gaze fixed on the deeper woods, on the unseen things that lurked beyond the reach of the failing light. A strange, protective stillness had fallen over the clearing. The air, which moments before had crackled with the electric promise of violence, now felt heavy-weighted with a question she could not parse. She could smell them, the scent of pine needles crushed under their paws, of cold earth, of clean, healthy fur. Beneath it all, a single unifying scent, the one that marked them as his, the Alpha Kings. It was the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, of ancient power held in absolute check. She lifted her eyes from the wall of gray fur and looked toward the ridge. He was there, as she knew he would be. A silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, motionless astride a war horse as black as a starless night. He was too far to see clearly, but she felt his presence, like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was the center of the silence, the axis on which this impossible moment turned Kalen, the Wolf King. His name was a whisper of fear and fealty in the villages, a curse on the tongues of the lords he had broken. He was a creature of brutal efficiency and unnerving calm, a king who had forged a fractured land into a weapon with nothing but his will and his wolves. The one directly in front of her, a massive female with a silver-scarred muzzle, shifted its weight. The soft crunch of frozen leaves, its head was turned away, but an ear swiveled back, tracking the sound of Alara's breathing. It knew she was there. They all knew. They had run her down with the terrifying patience of true predators, herding her into this small, defenseless clearing. The chase had been relentless, a drumbeat of paws that had shaken the very ground. She had run until her lungs burned and her muscles screamed, her smaller, nimbler form no match for their sheer, ground-devouring speed. When the circle had closed, she had prepared for the end. She had drawn her knife, not in hope of survival, but in defiance of an easy death. She would not be torn apart like a panicked doe, but the attack never came. Instead, this strange, unnerving vigil. They were not guarding her from escape. They were shielding her from something else. The thought was so absurd it almost made her laugh. A hysterical sound that died in her throat, an omega shielded by an alpha's pack. It was a violation of every law of nature, every brutal tenet of their society. Omegas were prizes or pawns, things to be claimed, broken, or discarded. They were never protected. On the ridge, the king raised a hand. It was not a signal to attack. It was a gesture of command, of absolute authority that needed no sound. He began to move his horse, picking its way down the steep, wooded incline with an unnatural sureness of foot. The descent was slow, deliberate. He was not a man who hurried. He made the world wait for him. As he drew closer, details emerged from the silhouette. The severe cut of his black leather tunic, the glint of a silver signet ring on his gloved hand, the dark, unreadable expression on a face that looked as if it were carved from the same granite as the mountains at his back. He did not look at his wolves. He did not need to. His attention was fixed entirely on her, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. Alara forced herself to meet it, to hold it. She would not show the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. She had been underestimated her entire life, seen as breakable, as lesser. That underestimation had become her armor. She had survived because she knew how to be still, how to watch, how to see the cracks in the world that others missed. She watched him now, a king descending into a circle of his own making, and wondered what crack he saw in her. He finally reached the edge of the clearing and dismounted in a single fluid motion. The creak of leather, the soft thud of boots on frozen ground. The great black horse stood without being tethered, its loyalty as absolute as that of the wolves. He walked toward her, his steps silent, his presence sucking the very air from the space between them. The wolves did not part for him. The circle remained unbroken. He stopped just outside of it, his gaze dropping to the knife still clutched in her hand. "The royal hunt is not for scavengers," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate in the hollow of her bones. It was not a shout, not a threat. It was a statement of fact, cold and precise. She did not flinch. "I was not scavenging. I was trapping." Her own voice was rough from the run, but it was steady. "My snares are half a league north. This is my territory." A flicker of something, not amusement, not surprise, something else, crossed his face. "All territory is mine." It was the simple, unassailable truth of his world. He took another step, and this time the massive female wolf in front of her moved aside, a silent, fluid parting of the gray wall. He stepped into the circle, into the space they had made for her. The scent of him was stronger now. Rain on stone, and something else beneath it, something wild and clean and utterly dominant. He was close enough now that she could see the silver threads at his temples, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. He was not a young king. He was a king who had been forged. "You are an Omega," he stated, his eyes tracing the faint scar that cut through her left eyebrow, a thin white line that was the only visible mark of a past she kept buried, unclaimed. She tightened her grip on her knife, uninterested. The word was out before she could stop it, sharp and defiant. A dangerous word to say to an alpha, a suicidal one to say to a king. A deep, profound silence followed. The wolves were utterly still, a circle of carved statues. The king's dark eyes held hers, and for the first time, she saw past the cold authority. She saw a flicker of profound, ancient loneliness, a stillness that came not from peace, but from a complete and total isolation. He had been alone inside his own silence for so long. "Why did they turn?" she asked. The question that had been screaming in her mind, her voice was barely a whisper. He looked away from her then, his gaze sweeping over the backs of his wolves toward the encroaching darkness of the forest. "Because there are worse things in the woods tonight than wolves," he said, "and my hunt knows its quarry." He looked back at her, and the stillness in his gaze was absolute. "And it is not you." He did not command her to drop the knife. He simply waited. The gesture was a test, a question asked without words. In the rigid hierarchy of their world, an Omega's submission to an Alpha was instinctual, a biological imperative. Defiance was an aberration, a flaw to be corrected, often violently. But he did not radiate the aggressive dominance she had been taught to expect, to fear. His power was a gravitational force, a quiet certainty that bent the world around him without effort. Holding his gaze felt like standing on a cliff edge, the wind threatening to pull her into the vast, empty space. Alara's fingers ached from her grip on the hilt. This knife was her last piece of herself, the final boundary between her and a world that had tried to consume her. To release it felt like a surrender she had sworn she would never make. But this was not a demand. It was a choice he was giving her, and the choice itself was a language she had not heard spoken in years. Slowly, deliberately, she relaxed her grip. The knife did not clatter to the ground. She sheathed it, the motion economical and precise, the soft scrape of steel against leather. His eyes tracked the movement, a flicker of approval in their depths. "You will come with me," he said. It was not a question. It was the new shape of her world. He turned, and the circle of wolves parted for them both. A silent, gray corridor leading out of the woods and into the king's shadow. The journey to the royal keep was conducted in the silence as vast and cold as the landscape. Kaelin rode, and she walked beside his horse, the wolves flanking them in a loose, disciplined formation. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic tread of the horse, the soft padding of paws, and her own steady footsteps on the frozen path. She was not bound. She could have run, but she knew with a chilling certainty that there was nowhere to run to. The wolves were a promise, and the king was the unwavering will behind them. To flee would be a pointless, exhausting death. So she walked, her senses on high alert, cataloging every detail of the man beside her. The way he held the reins loosely in one hand, his control so absolute it appeared casual. The way his gaze constantly swept the surrounding woods, missing nothing. He was a creature of immense, contained power, and she was an anomaly. He had collected a puzzle he had not yet solved. The keep rose from the jagged peaks like a shard of obsidian, its towers stark against the ink-black sky. It was a fortress, not a palace, built for war and endurance. As they passed through the massive gates, the sounds of the courtyard died. Men-at-arms, stable hands, servants, they all stopped, their eyes drawn to the king. And then with a mixture of shock and suspicion, to her and Omega. In the heart of the Alpha's power, brought in on the heels of the royal hunt, whispers followed them like ghosts. He led her not to the dungeons, but up winding stone staircases, through halls hung with tapestries, depicting brutal histories of conquest and sacrifice. The air grew warmer, thick, with the smell of beeswax and wood smoke. He stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open. "This will be your room." The chamber was larger than the entire cabin she had called home. A fire was already blazing in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rich, dark tapestries. A large bed was draped in furs, and a heavy wooden table stood near a leaded glass window that overlooked the sheer drop of the mountain. It was not a cell, it was a cage of unsettling comfort. "I," she began, but the words caught in her throat. He turned, his presence filling the doorway. "You will be safe here," he said, his voice flat, betraying no emotion. It was then that another man appeared behind him in the corridor, a stark contrast to the king's rugged austerity. This man was slender, dressed in fine velvets of silver and gray, his face handsome in a sharp, predatory way. His smile was polished, but it did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Your Majesty," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled silk, "an unexpected addition to our household." His gaze slid over Alara, dismissive and clinical, as if she were a piece of livestock. His tone clipped. "She is under my protection." Valerius's smile widened, a subtle, unpleasant thing. "Of course, a stray found in the woods. How compassionate. The law is quite clear on such matters, of course. Unclaimed omegas found on royal lands are wards of the crown, to be assessed and assigned. For the good of the pack." The words were a threat, wrapped in the language of civic duty. Valerius was the king's chief counselor, the master of laws and traditions, the architect of the rigid social structure that Kaelin had inherited and now ruthlessly maintained. He was the voice of the old way, the way that saw Ilara as property. Kaelin's stillness intensified. The air in the corridor grew thick, heavy. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "The law will be followed," Kaelin said, his eyes never leaving Valerius's, "when I deem it necessary. Until then, she is a guest." The word guest hung in the air, a direct challenge to Valerius's interpretation. A guest had rights. A stray had none. Valerius gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow. "As you command, Your Majesty." He glanced at Alara one last time, a look of speculative contempt, before turning and disappearing down the hall. The encounter left a chill in the air that the fire could not touch. Kaelin turned back to her. "Valerius speaks for the court," he said. "They see you as a disruption, a weakness." "Am I?" she asked, her chin lifting. His gaze was unnervingly direct. "That remains to be seen." He stepped back, pulling the heavy door with him. "You will not be locked in, but do not leave this wing. There are guards." The heavy thud of the door closing. He did not lock it. Another choice, another test. Alara stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the ice forming in her veins. She was not a prisoner, not yet. She was something far more dangerous, a symbol. And in the courts of kings, symbols were often the first to be sacrificed. She walked to the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. Below, the world was a sea of black, the forest a place of hidden teeth. She had been brought out of one wilderness and into another, and she was not sure which was more deadly. The first night in the keep was a lesson in the architecture of silence. The stone walls drank sound, leaving Alara in a profound quiet that felt more watchful than peaceful. She did not sleep. She sat in a high-backed chair before the fire, her worn knife resting on her lap, and listened. She listened to the settling of the ancient stones, the whisper of the wind against the glass, the distant rhythmic tread of the guards in the corridor. Every sound was a potential threat, every silence a question. She had lived her life on the edges, in the quiet places where she could see trouble coming long before it arrived. Here, in the heart of power, trouble did not announce itself. It moved in velvet shoes and spoke in polite, measured tones. Late, when the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, she heard footsteps stop outside her door. Not the heavy, predictable tread of the guards. These were lighter, more deliberate. Soft, knock. The sound was so unexpected it made her start. She stood moving silently to the side of the door, her hand closing around the hilt of her knife. "Enter," she said, her voice low and steady. The door opened, and it was him. The king. He was not dressed in the leathers of the hunt or the formal attire of the court. He wore a simple dark tunic and trousers, his feet bare on the cold stone floor. He held a small wooden tray on which sat a steaming mug and a piece of bread with cheese. The gesture was so mundane, so utterly at odds with the man, that it disarmed her more than any threat could have. He walked into the room and placed the tray on the table by the window. He did not look at her immediately, his attention on the careful placement of the offering. "You did not eat," he said. "It was not an accusation. I wasn't hungry. Now you are." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. The formal distance of the court was gone, stripped away by the late hour and the profound stillness of the castle. Here he was not just the king. He was an alpha, powerful and solitary, and she was an omega, an anomaly in his den. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the charged energy of their fundamental natures. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing everything. Why the protection? Why the room? Why the food brought by his own hand? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the fire. "My wolves have better instincts than my courtiers," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They do not see astray. They see." He trailed off, as if searching for a word he did not possess. He looked at her then, his eyes locking onto the scar above her eye. "Who gave you that mark?" The question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Her hand instinctively went to her face, a gesture of defense she despised in herself. The memory was a cold, hard thing, a piece of her past she never touched. "A lesson," she said, her voice tight. "From an alpha who believed omegas were made to kneel." Kalen's jaw tightened, a subtle shift of muscle that was more expressive than any outburst. He was wrong. The words were simple, declarative. He walked to the hearth, standing beside it, one hand resting on the cold stone of the mantelpiece. He was a creature of contrast, the savage power of the alpha, held in a body defined by absolute, unnerving control. "The world is as it is, Your Majesty," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "Or they are broken." "I do not rule to break things," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I rule to hold the line, against the chaos, against the dark. It is a solitary business." He spoke as if to himself, the words a rare crack in his armor of silence. She saw it then, the truth of him. He was not just isolated, he was utterly alone. Surrounded by a court that feared him, advisors who schemed, and a pack that obeyed his will but could not share its burden. He was the keystone in an arch, holding everything together and taking all the weight. He had forgotten the sound of a voice that did not want something from him. "Why me?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. "Why was I not the quarry?" He finally looked at her, and the loneliness in his eyes was a vast, empty landscape. "Because you're sent," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "When my wolves cornered you." It was not the scent of fear. It was the scent of defiance. It smelled like home. The admission was shocking, a raw nerve exposed. He seemed as surprised to have said it as she was to hear it. He straightened, the kingly mask snapping back into place. "Eat," he commanded, his voice once again brusque. "Tomorrow, Valerius will begin his games. You will need your strength." He turned and left as silently as he had come, the door closing with a soft, final click behind him. Alara stared at the space where he had been, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The scent of rain on stone lingered in the air. She walked to the table and picked up the mug. It was filled with warm, spiced milk. A child's drink, a comforting gesture. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest, and knew that the king's strange, solitary compassion was a far greater threat to her survival than his anger ever could be. True to Kaelin's warning, Lord Valerius began his games the next day. He did not challenge the king's decree directly. His methods were far more insidious. He moved through the court like a spider, spinning webs of rumor and doubt. Elara, confined to her wing, felt the effects without ever seeing the architect. The guards outside her door became colder, their expressions hardening from wary neutrality to open hostility. The servants who brought her meals would not meet her eyes, placing the trays down quickly and scurrying away as if she were a source of contagion. Whispers followed her whenever she paced the stone balcony that connected her rooms. Whispers of bad omen, unnatural, a taint in the heart of the pack. Valerius was using her as a weapon against his king. He was framing Kaelin's act of protection not as strength, but as a bizarre sentimentality, a weakness that threatened the stability of the throne. An alpha king, showing favor to an unclaimed, defiant Omega, was a violation of the natural order, a crack in the foundation of their brutal, hierarchical world. And Valerius was an expert at widening cracks until the entire structure collapsed. Elara understood the strategy perfectly. She had spent her life observing the subtle machinations of power from the shadows. Valerius was not trying to kill her. He was trying to make her a problem so toxic that Kaelin would have no choice but to solve it in the traditional way, by casting her out or forcing her into a submissive claiming that would break her spirit and reaffirm the old laws. One afternoon, a young servant girl, no older than 16, brought Alara's midday meal. The girl's hands were trembling so badly that the cutlery rattled on the tray. As she set it down, her eyes, wide with fear, met Alara's. "They say you have cursed the king," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lord Valerius says the hunt will fail and the winter will be hard because of you." "Lord Valerius is a liar," Alara said, her voice calm and even. The girl flinched, looking over her shoulder as if the counselor himself might materialize from the shadows. She curtsied hastily and fled the room. Elara looked at the food on the tray, a thick stew, fragrant with herbs and meat. It looked perfect, too perfect. She picked up the spoon, but instead of eating, she carried the bowl to one of the potted plants on the balcony. She poured a small amount of the stew onto the soil around the roots of a hardy winter rose. She ate the bread and the apple that had come with the meal, and she waited. By evening, the leaves of the winter rose had begun to blacken and curl at the edges. A slow, subtle poison, one that would cause sickness and weakness over days, easily mistaken for a common ailment, an accident. It was Valerius's signature. Precise, deniable cruelty. She did not tell the king. To do so would be to run to him for protection, to prove Valerius's point that she was a liability, a helpless creature he needed to manage. She would not give them that satisfaction. Instead, she adapted. She ate only what she could peel herself or what was brought directly from the communal kitchens by the one older servant who still looked at her with a glimmer of pity. She became even more watchful, her senses honed to a razor's edge. A few days later, the real danger came. She was on the balcony, a narrow stone walkway with a low parapet that overlooked the vast, windswept valley. The view was brutally beautiful, a panorama of granite and pine under a steel-gray sky. She was tracing the flight of a hawk when she heard a faint grating sound from the roof above her. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of survival, screamed. She did not look up. She threw herself sideways, rolling hard against the cold stone floor. A sharp crack, followed by a deafening crash. A massive block of decorative stonework, a gargoyle carved into the shape of a snarling wolf, shattered on the spot where she had been standing. Shards of stone flew across the balcony like shrapnel. Her shoulder throbbed where it had hit the ground, and her cheek was bleeding from a flying splinter. But she was alive. She pushed herself up slowly, her body aching, and looked at the rubble. A loose stone, another tragic accident. This time the guards in the corridor came running, their swords drawn. They saw her, disheveled and bleeding, saw the shattered gargoyle, and their faces were a mixture of shock and suspicion. One of them, a captain with a grim, scarred face, knelt and examined the point of impact. His eyes narrowed. He looked up at the roofline, then back at her. He said nothing, but a flicker of understanding of dawning respect crossed his features. Kalen arrived moments later. He moved, not with the haste of panic, but with a terrifying, controlled speed. He took in the scene in one sweeping glance. The rubble, the guards, her bleeding cheek, his eyes, dark as a winter storm, met hers. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not need to. The question was there, a silent, violent current between them. "Report," he said to the captain, his voice dangerously quiet. "It appears a section of the masonry gave way, Your Majesty," the captain said, his tone carefully neutral. "A weakness from the last frost, perhaps." Kalen walked to the largest piece of the shattered gargoyle. He nudged it with the toe of his boot. He then looked up, his gaze analytical, tracing the path of its fall. "The frost in my keep seems to have developed a sense of timing," he said, his voice laced with ice. He turned his attention back to Alara. Without a word, he reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a trickle of blood. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, the calloused skin of his thumb a strange comfort against hers. It was a gesture of shocking intimacy in front of his men. "This changes things," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. He dropped his hand and turned to the captain. "Double the guard. No one enters this wing without my direct authority. No one. And find the stonemason who last inspected this roof. I wish to have a word with him about the quality of his work." The captain bowed. "Yes, Your Majesty." As the guards began to clear the debris, Kalen stood beside her, a silent, imposing presence. He did not move away. He was a shield, a wall of quiet, simmering fury. The political games were over. Valerius had made a critical error. He had mistaken the king's strange Omega for a pawn. He had not realized until this moment that she was something else entirely. And in trying to remove her, he had just bound her to the king's side with chains of shared open danger. The aftermath of the accident was a new kind of silence. The overt hostility from the staff vanished, replaced by a palpable fear. The king's rage was a quiet thing, but it permeated the very stones of the keep. The stonemason was questioned, and Alara heard through whispers, swiftly exiled to the northernmost garrison for his negligence. Lord Valerius was conspicuously absent from court for 2 days. When he returned, he was paler, his polished smile tighter at the edges. He had been reminded of the line between political maneuvering and provoking the wolf at his own hearth. Kalen's solution to her safety was suffocatingly simple: proximity. He moved her from the guest wing to a chamber adjoining his own royal apartments. A heavy, ancient door, previously sealed, was opened between them. Her new room was starker, more masculine, decorated with maps and weapons instead of tapestries. It was a room that felt like an extension of the man himself, functional, formidable, and devoid of comfort. But it was safe. His personal guards, the grim-faced elites of his pack, were the only ones who walked these halls. Her world shrank to a handful of rooms, a private balcony, and the constant, unnerving presence of the king. They rarely spoke. They existed in a shared charged space, two solitary creatures orbiting each other. He would work late into the night at the massive oak desk in his study, the scratch of his quill, the only sound in the silence. She would sit by the fire in her own chamber, reading from the volumes of history and strategy she found on his shelves. The door between them left slightly ajar. The silence was not empty, it was filled with a taut awareness. She was always conscious of him, of his quiet breathing, of the sheer weight of his presence in the next room. She learned the rhythm of his burdens, the way he would rise and pace before the fire when a dispatch brought bad news, the deep stillness that fell over him when he was making a decision that would cost lives. She began to see the man beneath the crown, the immense, crushing weight he carried alone. One night, a fierce storm broke over the mountains, a gale of wind and freezing rain that hammered against the keep. The howl of wind, the relentless drumming of rain against glass. The storm seemed to get inside the walls, a wild, chaotic energy that mirrored the turmoil within her. Sleep was impossible. She rose and walked to the window, watching the lightning bleach the landscape white for a split second, revealing a world of violence and beauty. The door to his study opened wider. He was standing there watching her. "You cannot find rest either," he said. It was not a question. She turned from the window. "The storm is loud. It is not the storm that keeps you awake." He walked into her room, stopping a few feet away. The faint light from his study backlit his powerful frame. He was a creature of shadow and strength, yet in his eyes she saw a weariness that went bone deep. "This place, this life, it is a cage," she said, the words surprising her with their honesty. "For you as much as for me." He did not deny it. He simply nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It is the only life I have known." He looked up, and the formal barrier between them seemed to dissolve in the storm-lashed darkness. "Tell me about the scar," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its kingly command. "Not the lesson." She hesitated. The memory was a locked room inside her, a place she never visited. But in the strange intimacy of the stormy night, surrounded by his quiet strength, the lock began to turn. "I was young," she began, her voice a low murmur. "My family, we were nothing. Tenant farmers on the land of a minor lord. He was cruel. An alpha who enjoyed his power." She traced the scar with her fingertip, the skin smooth and numb. "When my first heat came, he decided he would claim me. It was his right," he said. "My father tried to stop him. The Lord had him beaten." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the only way she could tell it. "My mother, she hid me. She gave me this knife and told me to run. They cornered me in the woods, not unlike your hunt." A jagged fork of lightning illuminated the room, catching the stark, pained attention on Kaylin's face. "I did not kneel," she said. "I used the knife. I did not kill him, but I marked him. Before his men pulled me off him, he struck me with the pommel of his sword here." She touched the scar again. "They left me for dead, but I survived. I have been surviving ever since." The story hung in the air between them, ugly and unadorned. She had expected pity, or perhaps a grim approval of her defiance. She did not expect the profound, aching silence that followed. Kaylin stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked not at her, but through her, at the world that had created such a story. When he finally spoke, His voice was thick with a controlled glacial rage. What was his name? She shook her head. It doesn't matter. He is long dead. A border skirmish 10 years ago. Good. Kalen bit out. The single word, a chilling promise of what he would have done. He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. But she could feel the heat radiating from him, the immense protective fury that emanated from him like a physical force. "No one will ever lay a hand on you again," he said, and it was not a promise. It was a vow sworn to the storm and the night and the deepest part of his own soul. "I am not a thing to be protected, Kalen," she whispered, using his name for the first time. He finally met her eyes, and the desolation she saw there mirrored her own. "I know," he said. "That is why I must." In that moment, he was not a king saving a victim. He was a man bearing witness to her strength, to the scars she carried, and seeing not weakness, but a resilience that matched his own. And to be truly seen, she realized, was a more terrifying and profound intimacy than any touch. The storm raged outside, but in the quiet space between them, something had irrevocably broken, and something new, fragile, and fierce had begun to take root.